Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the Montpelier Happy Hour, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro. How are you doing, Emilie?
Hi, Olga. It's nice to see you today.
It's nice to see you too. Can you believe we're just like weeks, not even weeks away from the new biennium starting?
No, and I had such a nice solstice celebration with friends yesterday, and I feel
Oh.
like I'm at least doing a good job, like doing a little resting and nourishing while I prepare for the new year. So I am very excited for the new biennium and very glad that I still have these 2 weeks left before it's.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to be talking with you today because we have been checking in with some of the committee members to talk about what they think their committee will be working on in the new biennium. And of course, you, at least for another 2 weeks, is the vice chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. It's time to check in with you.
Yes.
So, before we dive in, you and I were talking before the show started, and I shared with you just the way my brain looks at some of your committee work. And I was, just for listeners, I was telling Emilie that, there are some committees who their job is to say, here's the pot of money and this is where it's going, like appropriations. And it's, to me, very straight line. And then like House Ways and Means to me is more like infrastructure. So, how does money move through the system? And how does revenues come in? Where do expenses go out? And just like roads and bridges, we tend to not pay attention to our infrastructure until it's not working very well.
Mhm.
And so that's one reason I'm excited to talk to you about House Ways and Means because yeah, this idea of infrastructure, does that resonate with you or?
Yeah, I had never thought about it that way before. I'm really excited for this new frame to think my way through it because, as you know, I love thinking about taxes like as philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've now outed myself as the biggest dork that's ever come on the Montpelier Happy Hour. This will help our future guests feel more welcome. Um, but yes, that really does resonate for me, partly because I think of taxes as sort of the not just the symbol, but like the symbol made practical or made
Mm-hmm.
tangible of this collective project of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm-hmm.
that, we come together like from the fields and forests and towns, form civilization, have government. That's like a government is, you know, what organizes civilization, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
way government functions is with resources.
Right.
And the fact that we collectively raise those resources, ideally, from each according to need and ability, um, like that's the work of the Ways and Means Committee. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, weaving that idea in as if it's like the, I want to say turrets, but like that's not the word I want. What's the stuff inside the bridge with the metal rods?
Um, the Yeah, good question. The framing,
Yeah, no, it's like anyway.
there's
Yeah,
engineers all over Vermont right now, like yelling at us. It's
I know,
Paula.
I know. I was thinking about like, yeah, I don't have any of the words here, but I think that's a really effective metaphor, even though I don't have the words for it. Um, and I think there's some, one example that really comes to mind for me is the idea of tax credits, which is essentially, someone often having extra resources because they're not paying in for taxes towards a policy goal
Mm-hmm.
versus someone paying those taxes and those taxes going towards that policy goal. And how like that shapes that conversation so much.
Hmm.
And so when I think about the child tax credit and this really incredible, we passed the largest state child tax credit in the country this last year. as sort of a follow-on to the promise of the federal child tax credit in the, in the pandemic. I think about all of these conversations that you and I have had, Olga, about the sort of industry that supports people living in poverty,
Mm-hmm.
and the barriers that are in place to make it hard to navigate those systems, and how there are also policy tools we have that can just end poverty
Mm-hmm.
rather than treating poverty. And I think the child
Right.
tax credit is one of those. And so that's just like incredibly exciting to me. And there's
Mm-hmm.
so many other examples of that. That's just one. And that's the case of a tax credit rather than an actual tax. But there are so many more. And I love to think about sort of that underlying structure. And when I've had a lot of conversations this summer about our property taxes and our school,
Right.
specifically our school taxes, on a part of a summer study committee. But whenever I look at an individual tax and making the individual tax have a smoother curve or not penalize someone or be more progressive, I try to think about it also in the context of how all of both the taxes and the other benefits that someone receives from government all sort of add up into a comprehensive picture of a taxpayer's experience of Vermont. And so that's a really like, if I think about sort of that web and those curves as like, the revenue infrastructure of the state, that's exciting to me. So thank
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. You're welcome. And for House Ways and Means, what are some of the things you think you'll be looking at this biennium?
Before I answer that, I would love to
Mm,
just like do a teeny tiny definition because I know I'm going to use the word progressive about 1,000 times
yes.
while we're talking. And I
Yeah,
just
that
want to be
sounds
really
good.
clear that I mean that mathematically and not politically,
Mm-hmm.
because I use that word for those two meanings often on this show. And they're very separate meanings. So progressive in terms of taxes means that folks essentially with less ability to pay less, and folks with more ability to pay more. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not necessarily because 10%, $10 from like all these different people might be 10% from one taxpayer and 0.01% from another taxpayer.
Right. Right.
And so a flat tax could be $10 from everyone. It could be 10% from everyone. But a progressive tax is usually when we think of like marginal tax rates. That's usually a progressive tax.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Do
what I mean.
you can you give listeners an example in Vermont where we might have a progressive tax versus what's a flat tax?
Um, so very clear progressive tax is our income taxes. And that there's like one bracket. So, and I don't have the tax brackets memorized. Please forgive me. That's why I have a computer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but essentially, sort of at the lowest tax bracket, you have a lower rate. Everyone pays
Mm-hmm.
that rate on their first, say, $30,000 in income. And
Right.
then any income that you have between, say, 30 and 60, you pay a slightly higher rate on that chunk of income. So that's both
Mm-hmm.
a marginal rate and a progressive structure. And
Okay.
often marginal rates are used to create progressive structure. So a marginal rate means you pay one, and then each sort of chunk on top of it, you pay just on that chunk on top of it. Um, and so as you sort of get into higher brackets, the percentage increases. That's a progressive tax rate.
Mm-hmm.
There are like a bajillion flat taxes. Probably the easiest example is municipal property taxes. You vote on a rate and that's charged on, per acre.
Mm-hmm.
You pay a tax per gallon on gasoline.
Yeah, sales taxes.
Sales tax. Sales taxes are generally considered regressive,
Mm,
because the majority of sales that people engage in are considered necessities, and everyone's paying the same rate. Um,
gotcha. Yeah.
so that has a smaller impact on the budget of people who have more money. And that's one of the reasons that we exempt most grocery products or all groceries from sales tax in Vermont, is in order to make that flat tax slightly more progressive.
Right. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so your question was, what do I think's on the docket in
Yeah.
2023? So one of the really fun things about being on the Ways and Means Committee is we have our own tax policy work that we do around sort of crafting, the state's revenue system and that revenue infrastructure that you described so aptly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also get to figure out any of the revenue and fee pieces that are connected to any other committee's bills. So almost all committee bills from other committees come through the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee.
Right.
Because anything with, say, a change in a regulatory structure might necessitate a change in the fees that are connected to that,
Mm-hmm.
or a change in how a department is structured, if that department's structure is supposed to be covered through fees, or something that's just going to cost a lot and someone knows that it'll never get covered if they don't connect a revenue source to it, or because as we've talked about before on the show, because our education system is funded according to its need rather than according to its budget, any new education spending always comes, or any new education policy always comes to the Ways and Means Committee, because it will have an immediate impact on taxpayers' property tax rates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we get to do all those things. So bills that I think will come through from other committees that are going to be sort of heavier lifts for Ways and Means is universal family medical leave insurance. I'm very excited about. I think we've talked about the need for that on this show many times. But certainly since the pandemic, just how much I think families deserve and need that insurance in order to make their lives work, in order to care for themselves and others. It's just like, it's big policy I've been championing for a while. And we've come close to passing it a number of times. And so setting the insurance rate for that is going to be the work of the Ways and Means Committee. And we have a big lift coming this year for universal childcare, universal affordable accessible childcare. We've talked about that on the show before.
Yep.
And so there are a lot of questions about how that will be funded. And there's a study coming out about a month into the session that will point us towards how much that system is expected to cost.
Okay.
And once we have a sense of how much that system is expected to cost, the study is going to have a few revenue sources in it as sort of example revenue sources, but it's not going to be like a clear plan for revenue.
Right.
Looking forward to seeing that and reading that to figure that one out. There are big questions because right now part of our childcare is paid for as part of our public school system through the not universal but called universal pre-K system. And I think Teresa and I, spent a
you
moment
riffed on that a little bit.
Yes. And then part of it is paid for through federal money called CCFAP, Child Care Financial Assistance Program, and that goes through the Agency of Human Services. And so already early care and education in Vermont is funded through two different agencies. And so that's that have a lot of governance challenges amongst themselves. And so it's one of those places where it's not just about finding out where the money is going to come from, but also finding out how the architecture of how the money flows influences the governance and the administration of these programs. And so that's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excited about that. I think there are a lot of conversations about housing right now.
Yes.
And so I think certainly there will be a number of housing bills that come through the committee. Changes in zoning designations often trigger a review by Ways and Means because there are a few tax credits that are connected to zoning designations. So neighborhood development areas or downtown designations all have tax credits connected to them. So when the designation changes, that might mean that the tax credit eligibility gets expanded. And so that would come through Ways and Means.
Hmm.
But I think there are also a lot of conversations happening right now about our property taxes and how they might meet or not meet the needs of our housing market. And so that will be like a ways and means centered conversation, one of our sort of tax policy
Hmm.
conversations that I'm looking forward to. I had a really interesting conversation with all of the trash haulers in Windham County the other day.
No kidding.
Yeah. We have all of the Windham County delegation sets aside
Hmm.
3 or 4 days each biennium to meet with basically like every
Right.
nonprofit, interest group, et cetera, that wants to meet with us. Historically, we would sort of go hither and yon and, wind up at breakfast in 5,000 places. And we decided to consolidate and really just sort of like that way people have a much better chance of meeting with each of us because so many of us work and have sort of wild schedules. So anyway, Sarah Coffey was kind enough to invite all the trash haulers. And I think partly because I live in Brattleboro, where we have really just like such deep municipal services,
Yeah.
I have not spent as much time thinking about trash haulers as I should have. And I can't think about everything.
No,
Um,
this is true.
but we spent a lot of time on a bottle bill last
Huh,
biennium that in
that's
the
right.
end did not pass. It got stuck in the Senate. But what was interesting in talking to the trash haulers is that when we were talking about the bottle bill last biennium, it really, and it comes to ways and means because we were the ones who had set both the amount, the
Like the
refund, basically,
redemption. Yep.
yeah, the redemption, the deposit rate, um, which actually then that money, sort of talking about the architecture of money, when you pay that money, that deposit, that fund that the term for what happens is you're actually that money is escheated. I can never say it. It's like my favorite word that I can't ever say. It's ESCHEATS, I think. Um, and it's sort of like a trust tax, but it's a little bit different.
Mm,
Um,
hmm.
but anyway, it's sort of like held. Um, lost property is in that same category. It's like
Okay.
anyone's. It's just like sitting there. A trust tax is that a merchant holds a tax on behalf of government and then remits it to government. But things
Mm.
that are sheeted are like in this like liminal, no one owns them space, those
Oh,
dollars. Yeah.
interesting.
The lost property is one of them that sits in the treasurer's office. And then this is deposits like this are another one. I'm glad you think it's interesting. I think it's
Mm, I do actually.
very metaphysical.
It's like money just sitting in the ether.
And so there's this word for like the liminal money that is impossible to pronounce, but it looks very nice on paper. Um, anyway, so we were having these conversations about and there's like another fee attached to it that's not worth getting into. But in the conversations about the bottle bill, which got very heated,
Mm,
it
I
was really
remember.
this conversation between like Casella Waste, which is like pretty much a massive monopoly on huge parts of our waste disposal and recycling systems in Vermont, and the environmental lobby.
Hmm.
And that was like how the whole conversation was framed. But in talking to all, we have like a huge number of small trash haulers in Windham County,
Yeah.
apparently a lot more than other counties,
Hmm.
um, where it's mostly a monopoly. But like we've had all of these family trash hauling businesses really like um, sustain themselves here in Windham County. And they have to go quite far in order to do their it's
Their
not
roots.
dumping, but their roots, the tipping before
Yeah.
they. So anyway, in talking to them, they would love the bottle bill because the more glass that's removed from the waste stream of the recycling that they pick up, the cheaper it is for them because it's so heavy. So wine
Oh.
bottles and what like so anyway, they would love for the bottle bill to pass, which was like not at all the story that we were getting. So I'm really
Hmm.
excited to have like another bottle bill conversation. I feel like really hyped up on that now from this really great conversation with the trash haulers.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
You wouldn't see that coming. Yep.
Um, and I live on Good Enough Road, and I got to meet one of the Good Enoughs from Good Enough um, Rubbish, and so that was really.
Hmm.
Anyway, so that's something else I'm excited about for this upcoming year. What else? Big conversation about school construction and PCBs.
Oh, yes.
Most states have a statewide fund of some kind for school construction. Vermont did for
Hmm.
a long time, and then it stopped. Some individual school districts are able to bond for their school construction needs, and some communities are not able to pass a bond because of community flavor, let's call it.
Whatever. Yeah. Votes, the
The
way the
will of the
votes
voters.
go.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that creates like huge inequities in the quality of our school buildings around the state.
Mm. Hmm.
And so we have this like 20-year school construction overview that's taken 3 years to develop. We're getting part of it this year and another part of it next year. And they're looking at every single school building in the state and doing like a really full appraisal of what is needed construction.
Wow. Wow.
Simultaneous with that and separately, we have a PCB study coming, following up on Burlington High School,
Hmm.
which every student at Burlington High School got moved into the Macy's in the mall downtown because they couldn't be in the school building. They now need to tear the building down. They're suing.
Oh, I don't remember that part.
Monsanto. It's not Monsanto. They're suing some huge chemical company that I should remember the name of, who created the PCBs. And now the company is suing the school district, telling them they can't tear down the building because it's part of the court record. It's part of the court
Oh, jeez.
stuff. And I'm a little short on words today. But anyway, so all over the state, there's probably some degree of PCB contamination in schools that were built sort of all within the same decade.
Hmm.
And so in Wyndham Southeast, there's one school, likely was a little bit of PCB contamination. And so we're having a conversation about what's the cost of mitigating all of those PCBs.
Right.
And so those two conversations need to come together because a lot of school construction would actually mitigate the PCBs. A lot of PCB mitigation would probably be, important construction. Yeah. We need to find not just money to do that, but we also need to find a way to equitably decide which schools get that funding,
Right.
what schedule.
Right.
And so that's going to be a really fun conversation with the treasurer, likely around like what it would look like for the state to bond on behalf of schools and behalf of communities. How do we prioritize all of that? Looking forward to that. There's some great examples from Massachusetts and Rhode Island that I'm looking forward to. Yeah. And there's just like a million other little things. But I think the really big ones are like childcare, family medical leave, school construction, and then like fun internal ways and means policy conversations around property taxes, around corporate taxes, like really getting into the weeds.
So, curiosity question, Emilie.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of committees that can, for lack of a better term, they're kind of, when it comes to policy, they're kind of generative. Someone, people sponsor a bill and it goes to a committee. And there are some that are really obvious, like agricultural issues are going to the ag committee, that type of thing. Does ways, it seems to me just in what you're sharing that ways and means is more of maybe a receiving committee rather than how often do bills really go straight from being sponsored to your committee, or do you tend to wait more for other bills to come from other committees? Does that
Yeah. No, I understand your question. So the way like I would think about it in sort of legislative terminology, your question is like, do we have the same number of bills that are sort of like just sent directly after first reading to our wall as other committees? I think we usually have like around 30 bills on the wall from other committees. I don't think that's I think that's probably on the lower side, but not like extremely lower than some policy committees. Some policy committees get a lot. It feels like around the same number of bills that might go to commerce, but maybe I'm wrong. And then we get a huge number from other committees, but we move through them pretty fast. And so the number of bills sort of like on the wall at any time is usually like right around the number of bills that have been sent directly to the committee.
Hmm.
And we tend to not, historically, in my experience in Ways and Means, we tend to not pick up that many of the bills from the wall, because our focus really is on either the bills that are coming in from other committees that need to be cared for as part of all the hard work that other committee has done, or be generating committee bills on sort of these broader tax issues. Usually the
Hmm.
bills that get sent on first reading that are sponsored by other members who aren't on the committee are usually like funny little tweaks, that like someone discovered, and sometimes we'll integrate that into like another technical bill or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, so, another member discovered this last session something funny about how like property inheritance um worked between like parents but not between siblings, and like shouldn't
Hmm.
siblings be able to inherit directly from each other without paying certain gains taxes, and it was stuff like that. So like that's the kind of thing that happens. Very rarely are those revenue raising bills.
Hmm. Okay.
Usually those are revenue reduction bills.
Oh, interesting.
This is
Okay.
that I think deserves a tax credit. That would be yeah.
Hmm. And how it sounds like just a lot of work, and I'm wondering, if a bill has a heavy lift, like we've been talking about paid family leave for a while,
Mhm.
it has to go through a number of committees before reaching you,
Yeah.
but it sounds like there's a risk of things getting held up
Mhm.
in Ways and Means if you have such a churn.
We have a really good committee assistant
Hmm.
who does an incredible job making sure that we have sort of the witnesses. It's a really interesting position to be in as a member. So there's one thing when you vote for something in your policy committee and you've like hashed that thing to death. You've pulled it apart, you've put it back together, you've heard from everyone who's ever had a feeling about the thing you're going to do. You have like discussed it. And so like when you get to your yes or no, you've like really found your way to whatever that is in a
Hmm.
meaningful way. And then when you're on the House floor, um, there's sort of an expectation that if you're in a majority party, you're going to vote yes unless you have like a really strong reason to vote no.
Hmm.
Um, and you do your best to understand the issue, but there isn't sort of an expectation that you understand everything about that issue. Excuse me. Um, in the case of a money committee who sort of gets that next round, you don't have time to pull it apart and put it back together.
Hmm.
And so, but you need to like really vote on it in a very meaningful way,
Hmm.
because you're sort of validating that piece of legislation on behalf of the whole body.
Interesting.
And this is sort of like a little bit of an inside baseball cultural thing. So if it gets boring, like
Mm-mm.
at me or something, and the people on the radio won't hear. But we do our very, very best, and it's very hard to do sometimes, and we don't always succeed, nor should we always try to succeed at this, to only focus on the aspects of a bill that are related to revenue and leave the
Hmm.
other policy things there on the table, um, and trust that that committee has done its work. But it is hard because, like, once you got your hands in something, you kind of want to pull it all apart and put it together.
Well, I can imagine it's a little bit like our conversations with charter changes in that the town has vetted this charter change. So just to prove what the town has vetted, and yet I can imagine when you see some of these charter changes, you want to get your thumbs in them.
Oh my goodness, yes. And I am like very rigid about charter changes. And I vote for them because that's the will of like hundreds and thousands of voters.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is like six people thought this was a good idea.
Hmm.
Mhm. And like, thousands of people thought those 6 people should be in office making this decision. So like, who am I? So, but anyway, that's like sort of a funny part. So we like tend to really just try to narrow our focus on those bills that are moving through that seem like they'd be might be more time consuming.
Right.
And then for
Wonderful.
something like, say, the family medical leave insurance bill, um, while we might not pick it up in committee until the bill formally came over, there's background work that the Joint Fiscal Office would be doing on it. And they're a very, very close partner of the committee. And so they do a lot of work to prepare for anything that's coming into our committee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can imagine there's a lot of implications you need to understand that policies could have
Yeah.
on revenue and impact on people, and yeah.
Yeah.
So we are out of time in this first half of the Montpelier Happy Hour. So everybody here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on BCTV and many of the public access stations around Vermont, and even a few in other states in New England, which is kind of exciting. You can also find us wherever you find your podcasts and on our Captivate page. Hey, Emily.
Hey, Olga.
What are we going to remind people of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, not the station that is broadcasting those thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we're going to talk about wealth in the second half, but I think the other thing we need to riff on is we're coming to the end of 2022.
That is the rumor.
Yeah, we have one more show before the calendar changes. So what do you think? We have to design our 2022 cocktail.
Oh gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
We may have to think about it until next week.
Yeah.
If I was designing my 2022 cocktail, as you know, I've had a bit of upheaval in my life, so I think I would need something you could set on fire. Just saying.
I have also had a year full of transitions and a lot of new beginnings. And
Mm-hmm.
2023 is going to include even more new beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's definitely a thing. I don't want to call a cocktail the new beginning because that just, I don't actually want to drink that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I might need to think about it some more until next week. I mean, yeah, and I've been playing, I went down to Provisions in Northampton.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah. And I actually sent pictures of the fancy liquor I bought to Wendy Knight, the commissioner of liquor, to be like, look, we could have nice things in Vermont too.
We
Um,
could.
um, gosh, that's so off track. But there's this amazing bergamot and rose Italian liqueur that I bought.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. And it's just like, first of all, it is just like so. I've been using the term lady people instead of like femmes or women. And I don't know like how it happened. And it just feels like, for me, it's this like big taking back of a term.
Mm-hmm.
But also feels like more gender expansive than women.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I feel like the Italian bergamot and rose liqueur is just like the most lady people of mixer. And so it's fantastic with gin. It's fantastic with like any of your sparkling wines. And it makes just like a very nice light thing with some seltzer and a little wedge of lemon. But I don't know if that's the drink of the year. It might just be like a thing that's delicious right now. So let's keep on maybe thinking about it.
Okay, we shall do that. We'll have to design our 2022 cocktail.
Mhm.
We'll see what. So next week we'll have Stephanie Yu from the Public Assets Institute on. So maybe she can weigh in on it too.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe we should warn her in advance. That we're going to talk
By the way, not only do you have to
anyway.
talk about the economy, you
Yeah.
need to design a cocktail.
Mhm. But yeah, like we have both had a lot of upheaval and change, and I think a lot emerges from that. And what I've been sitting with in terms of my policy, political, legislative life.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know why I felt like I had to hyphenate that, but is those conversations that we had early in the pandemic.
Hmm.
And there was this there was right around the same time that Arundhati Roy was talking about the pandemic as a portal.
Hmm.
I'm sure you remember that. We talked about that a lot.
Yeah.
There was this video by an activist named Valerie Kaur, Kaur,
Hmm.
and she was talking about sort of the darkness that we were in right now and talking about how maybe it's not the darkness of death, but it's in fact the darkness of the birth canal, and we're like emerging into something.
Hmm.
Um, and so, like those I'm still sitting with those possibilities, and not like in a naive, optimistic way,
Hmm.
but just like a real curiosity, like what's available if I try to think of my work in that mode.
Yeah.
Like from all of this struggle, what does this struggle make possible? What do people
Hmm.
see because we are struggling that they wouldn't have seen otherwise? Um what is like more than alleviating suffering, but actually creation? That kind of thing. So that's those are my deeply philosophical New Year's thoughts for you. Um, and also like in this time of like deep hibernation
Yeah.
and like looking at the small lights of the candles and the fires. Been thinking a lot about what a politics looks like when like we're really settled into our bodies,
Hmm.
settled into our communities, and not being reactive and righteous and scared, but
Yeah.
instead like steady and curious and connected.
Hmm.
So those are my intentions in the new year.
Nice. I haven't really set intentions yet. What I have been sitting with myself, based on this year of upheaval, trying to really sit with and see like where do I need to keep forging something? Like if you think about like
Mhm.
making a sculpture or like
Mhm.
where do you need to just keep carving and forging so that you can um, make something out of this hunk of rock you've been
Mhm.
given? And where do I just need to embrace it as it is?
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes over this past few months that hasn't been clear.
Mhm.
But try to be better at seeing that. Like where do I need to keep fighting
Mhm.
or forging, and where do I need to embrace?
Yeah, I guess I have been working on not thinking about things that dualistically,
Mm-hmm.
because in legislative work, um, I'm so scared of giving up,
Mm-hmm.
of the idea of giving up or releasing. And so I think for everything that we sort of release from and like follow along the current, that also shapes that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that
That's
like
true.
as we're shaping something, we're also releasing from the things that are sloughed off.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think there is as much of a tension there as you are describing necessarily.
Yeah. For me, I don't think it's so much of attention as in how am I using my energy and my resources.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, hear that.
Mhm. Um, so
Speaking of
talk,
resources,
yeah, let's talk about wealth.
yeah. So I gave this training recently with a few other people, with Steph Yu from the Public Assets Institute, who's coming on next week, and
Yeah.
with Colin Robinson from the NEA, the teachers union,
Okay.
about education finance in Vermont. And education in most of the country is funded out of the property tax.
Hmm.
And I think it's really actually helpful to start with a history lesson in order
Okay.
to understand that. And that's like essentially that schools were some of the very first things that were ever built by communities with collective resources in the colonies, right? Or in America,
Ah, okay.
right? Like what else was built?
Probably churches or
Different.
places of worship.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a system from the old country about building churches, though, right? Like you tithe to build churches. And that's
True.
sort of like
True.
taxes, but it's a little bit different, right?
Yep.
Um, and so, and property at that time, when property taxes were first created, was actually defined more broadly than it is now.
Hmm.
So, properties for the purpose of property taxes was any sort of tangible good that you had. And so,
Hmm.
property wasn't just your land, it was also like the buildings on your land, right? We use
Yep.
that, we use my property tax now, but it also include like your oxen and your wagon, right?
Hmm.
That kind of stuff. And the reason that we used that as a way of figuring out how much taxes someone owed was because it was like a very close proxy for the amount of wealth someone had at that time in America,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
That's where people kept their wealth at that time in America. They didn't keep
Hmm.
it in gold. They didn't have necessarily like, we were just creating corporations. Um, and so wealth was held in tangible goods. And those tangible goods stood, you knew how many resource someone had because you could see it and you could count it. And that's how you charge taxes. What's interesting is that we've actually, rather than broadening that definition of property,
Hmm.
we've actually narrowed it a little bit,
Hmm.
right? So it just includes land and buildings and the
Okay.
value of buildings. We don't include those other sort of tangible goods that someone has. Um, and then sort of the other way that we tax someone's wealth, other than property, is income.
Hmm.
Because that was sort of the second round of how we might understand wealth. People
Right.
started working more professional jobs. We like built a middle class.
Hmm.
I mean, we didn't build a middle class. Black people built a middle class, really. Like slaves built a middle class, but
Yes. Yeah.
onwards from there. And that middle class, their major wealth could be measured in income, how much they got made
Hmm.
a year, right? And you wouldn't want to just say how much someone had in their bank account, because at that time people were really like spending that money as it was coming in.
Hmm.
And so the best proxy for sort of how much ability someone had to pay at that then became income.
Okay.
Now, middle class people, still income, best proxy for wealth, for ability
Hmm.
to pay. But wealthy people, property is not a good proxy for the most part. Someone's like land or houses is probably a very, very, very tiny percentage of the amount of assets that a wealthy
Hmm.
person has.
Hmm.
And their annual income is often also not a very useful proxy of the amount of assets that a very wealthy person has, because their income might be how they're drawing down on a trust annually.
Hmm. Hmm.
Often they're not working for wages or even
Right.
salary, right? Um, there are a lot of ways of moving debt around
Yep.
in contemporary financial markets, so that actually you can derive, like you can live on credit that you get from assets that you're not touching, right?
Hmm.
And so right now in America, we actually don't, and like these are not my own brilliant thoughts, right? Like,
Hmm.
Warren's been is probably like a public figure
Yes.
talking about this. Like I don't mean to say these are my brilliant thoughts. I'm just saying that a Ways and Means Committee that is doing its work well is building, like you said, the infrastructure for state revenues. And when we build infrastructure, we don't build infrastructure for the year we're living in. We build infrastructure that's supposed to last 20 years, right?
Hmm.
And so we
Yeah.
need to be constantly looking into the future for what is the next, how is wealth held? What is the most effective way to know ability to pay? Or to even just know where the money is in our communities, right? Like
Hmm.
taxes should come from where the money is in a community, right? Like that's what taxes are. And so we need to be constantly shifting our definitions and our understanding of ability to pay and resources in order to be building a tax structure that's resilient to future.
Hmm.
And right now, what that looks like is figuring out ways to like maybe move beyond these narrow definitions of property and these narrow definitions of income to really understand like what wealth looks like in these very dynamic international, almost entirely AI driven like financial markets, right? Um,
Hmm.
and so that's like, it's something that the IRS is like not really catching up on. It's something that Biden and Elizabeth Warren have done a decent amount of talking about
Hmm.
in the context of the billionaires tax. Um, and it's something that we've done a little bit of with our corporate tax regime in Vermont last year,
Okay.
but we can do more on. But with regards to personal wealth, we have not even begun to scratch the surface of what that means and how to do it at a state level. And so I'm like very curious about that as we sort of enter the next decade in our state.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, Looking for the right words. For lack of a better words, what does wealth look like in Vermont? And the reason I ask that is because I think we're not very good at really knowing like, oh, so this income level makes me solid middle class, or because I have this X, Y, and Z, that puts me in this bracket. I'm not so sure we're good at being able to see those things. So,
Yeah, and I think that's a conversation that like will be hashed out well with Steph next week.
mhm,
But first of all, like we're not an island. We're not even
right.
close to an island. We are a teeny tiny state with very few people in the midst of a very large country with a lot of people.
Hmm.
And we, here in Brattleboro, live on the border of two other states,
Yeah.
like tight border, right? So it's silly. I think it is silly on some level to have these conversations in isolation. And we have a state government, and I'm a legislator in that state government. So of course I have to have those conversations to some degree in isolation. Last time I checked, the 1% in Vermont was just folks with an income of like over $180,000 a year, $190,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
That is not true in most other states.
No.
Vermont is also one of the only states in the country, possibly the only state in the country without a billionaire.
No kidding.
Don't ever own billionaire. Yeah. I don't know if like maybe the governor's tourism and marketing board wants to like go out and find us one, pay them $5,000 to move here. I don't know. It'd be helpful. Every state needs their own pet billionaire. But no, we don't. Please forgive me.
I I know we don't
Blythe
allow
attitude.
billboards, but I can see the billboard anyway. Yes.
Yes, please forget my blithe attitude towards the billionaires. It's actually an atrocity that that's acceptable while
Hmm.
people are hungry and homeless. But so anyway, we don't have a billionaire. Our 1% is very low. And so what's interesting is like what is the, class in America is complicated. I think class in Vermont is even more complicated.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Everyone wants to be working class here. have to work an hourly wage to be working class. Like that's sort of the definition, one of the definitions of working class. Not that many
Mm-hmm.
people really do that anymore.
Right.
Um, Middle class, is it like, are we talking about like the mathematical middle class, or are we talking about a cultural middle class? Are we talking about education levels? We have some of the highest college education rates in the country,
Mm-hmm.
some of the highest high school graduation rates in the country. We don't have some of the highest rates of high schoolers going to college. We tend to have
Yes.
college educated people come here from away. So like
Mm-hmm.
those numbers are weird. Um, but we are certainly less wealthy than a lot of states. We have not updated those numbers. I've not seen updates to those numbers since the pandemic, though. And we
Okay.
know that a lot of wealth um, has come into the state since then.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing that I think is very interesting about wealth in Vermont is that in a lot of other states, farmers are some of the very richest people. And that is not how we talk about America a lot of the time.
Right.
But it is true in a lot of areas of the country. Um, that it's like sort of the small town gentry is the farmer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is not true in Vermont. Our
Right.
farms are much smaller than that.
Mm-hmm.
Though some of the generational wealth that's been possible from some of those firms actually has made that true. It's just less
Mm-hmm.
true as a rule than it is in some other states. Um, and so those are some of the interesting dynamics about wealth in Vermont. I think I'll pause there. That's what I think we could dig into that more with stuff though. I think that would be fun.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Well, and I there's so much around the conversation around wealth and class that is just so loaded.
Mhm.
And there's emotionally where we put ourselves versus what our bank account might say, and they're not always the same thing.
Absolutely, in all directions. And I think it's a really interesting thing in the legislature when we talk about it, because legislators, like everywhere else in the country, are wealthier than the general population, but also because our communities are so small,
Mm,
um, everyone like tends to have a personal relationship of some kind with a fairly wealthy person in their community,
hmm.
which I think is not true in a lot of the country.
Right.
And so that's a really, VPR did like this interesting series on class. And Erica Heilman from Rumble Strip did like one of the episodes of it. It was like last month or something.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
Um, and her episode was just like this really fun interview with this woman in the kingdom, just like going on about how she perceives class. And it was great. I really recommend it. But all to say, like, it's personal here in a way that it isn't.
Hmm.
And I think, the reactivity of politics all over the country, I think the reactivity around class is harder for people here, even though the impacts of class and the impacts of wealth disparity is just as extreme and difficult here as it is anywhere else.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, everybody circle back to next week because Stephanie Yu from the Public Assets Institute will be with us, and we'll be talking more about that and also the annual State of Working Vermont report that the Public Assets Institute puts out every year. And I love that report.
Mhm. I
It's
know
my
it's really
favorite
cool. I
report.
mean, I think it's a very good report too, but I also just like love how much you love it.
um, so Emilie, the conversation about wealth, I think gets circles us back a little bit to where we started this conversation in the first half of the hour, looking at some of the philosophy and the structures that like hold up our financial system.
Mhm.
Are there and I know, sorry, I know that you've worked a lot on school education funding, and I think you were on a task force to look at turning the education funding from a property-based income tax to a property-based tax to an income-based tax.
Mhm.
What are some other things you're looking at? Are there other concepts or philosophies or um, ways that you feel our tax system could work better and be more equitable?
Um, and that task force wrapped up yesterday, actually. So if anyone is like hot and excited to see our report, it should be posted the next couple of weeks to the website. So
Very cool.
that website, we have our own committee website that is hosted on the Joint Fiscal Office website, which you can find the link for on the legislature's website.
Okay.
Anyway, so other things I'm thinking about. So one conversation that I think is very poignant is the conversation about the wealth gap, particularly with regards to Black people in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I read this really incredible book about sort of causes and solutions for it. And
Mm-hmm.
one very interesting detail to me was this idea of joint versus single filing.
Hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah,
Have
yeah.
I talked about this on the show before?
No, but I was reading something about
Yeah,
it
I'm
recently.
really, and the idea that joint filing um, really prioritizes and benefits families where only one person works over families where two people work.
Mm-hmm.
And that we know that families where only one person works tend to be wealthier families and tend to
Right.
be whiter families. And that's just like a really interesting piece of the whole puzzle to me, like how the tax system would prioritize one family structure over another, right?
Right. Right.
So that's something that I sit with in terms of fairness in the tax system, and is just like a nightmare to unfold.
Unravel.
Yeah.
Unknot. Yeah.
Um, so that's one. Other things I think about is how and when it's appropriate to use taxes as a tool for policy change or
Hmm.
behavior change.
Kind of like syntax
Yes,
or
I have.
yeah.
Yes. So, people feel very good about taxes on tobacco with the idea that if it got more expensive, less people would smoke. And less people are smoking now. And so people think that's validation for the fact that, um, I don't know how many poor people gave more than their fair share to the government
Mm-hmm.
because of those cigarette taxes.
Yeah.
And like I understand that it's like probably, it's good for public health that less people smoke. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there are always conversations around sugar taxes
Right.
um, for very similar conversation. And the idea is if it pays for a public nutrition campaign, doesn't that make it worth it? If it pays for school lunches, doesn't it make it worth it? Um,
Mm-hmm.
there was a study that just came out around opening up sports betting in Vermont. Um, that sort of is the other end of sin taxes. So if something is
Right.
illegal, like say sex work or sports betting or cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
why not regulate it, make it slightly safer, and have um, public benefit from that revenue?
Mm-hmm.
That's always an interesting question, sort of on
Yeah.
that same thread. Um, I was thinking about library fines today, and I was
Oh,
thinking about like,
right.
what's my favorite tax or fee? And I was thinking about library fines just because I used to like love to pay them. Like I would have been like, a derelict person because I hadn't turned a like terrible library delinquent. My book was late because I was like enjoying it too much or like whatever,
Mm-hmm.
where I like felt
Slow
attached to
reader.
it.
Yeah.
Didn't want to, or just like I had a hard week or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then like I'd get a library fine. I'd be like, oh, I don't mind like giving $5 to my library. Like, this is not the worst thing that's ever happened to me. This is great. Like, because I believe in where the revenue is going. So I like don't mind
Mm-hmm.
paying it. And then in Brattleboro and many other places in the country, they realized that the policy goal of fining people which they thought was to get people to return their books, was actually just making a lot of people scared of the library. And so they just stopped. And like that ability to stop and be like, oh no, we're not doing what we think we're doing with our moralistic nonsense. And like pivoting is so cool. And I like want to be that flexible of a tax creator. So that's another one. That's like some more philosophy of taxes that I think are interesting. And then the last one that I'll sort of put into the hopper is, how does one revenue source now and the investments that come from that revenue source create more revenue in the future?
Mm-hmm.
So I think about that one a lot. So like, how does raising revenue to pay for family medical leave insurance both save money because children have happier, healthier beginnings, maternal child health is stronger, people are more able to stay in their jobs longer term because they have that stability in a hard time. All of that, how does that make like a healthier population to save money from the state because the state pays for negative health outcomes? And how does that get more revenue into the state because people are working more and making more at work?
Right.
And so that is like another fun philosophy of the tax system that I think about a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's ultimately the long-term ramifications of our decisions and our policy.
Yeah.
Well, Emilie, thank you so much. We are out of time here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, but as always, it's a pleasure.
Absolutely. As the sun sets around us, we better get off the call soon, Olga. I can see both of our like rooms.
If people want to learn more about you, Emilie, where do they go?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org. You'll find links to my newsletter sign up and my newsletters and my email and my social medias. I have been on a bit of a hiatus with updating it because everyone deserves a hiatus. And I will jump back in to the communication pit.
the bottomless pit. Yes. Well, and as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2, as well as our Captivate page, our Facebook page, and wherever you find your podcasts. See you next week, everyone. Have a great weekend.